A wealthy collector drops dead mid-auction, but what was he hiding behind the final bid? Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Let's grow this mystery-loving family. Drop a comment with your location. Your messages always brighten my day. Let's begin. The village of St. Hedwig's Cross was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, unless one counted Mr. Partridge's weekly complaint about the post being late or Mrs. Beale's latest attempt at jam that turned out more medicinal than fruity. Nestled beyond the lavender fields and just past the crooked oaks, the village seemed untouched by time. Its greatest event of the year was the Summer Preservation Society's garden auction, held on the wide lawns of the old vicarage. That year's gathering promised to be no different. Dozens of flower pots, old books and vintage oddities up for bidding, all for the benefit of the village library roof. Miss Marple, wrapped in a pale blue cardigan despite the early June warmth, had accepted Mrs. Banbury's invitation to attend. "It's always the same crowd," the older woman had said, fussing with her brooch, "but this year we've a special item, a piece from the late Mr. Fitzwilliam's estate. A clock, they say, 18th century French, supposedly." That was enough to stir mild interest among the villagers. Mr. Leonard Fitzwilliam, an eccentric and reclusive antique collector, had passed away just 3 months earlier, found slumped over his desk with a half-finished letter in his typewriter and a crystal decanter at his elbow. The old vicarage's lawns were buzzing by 2 o'clock. Trestle tables sagged under the weight of donated goods, children darted between garden paths, and gossip clung to the hedges like bees to clover. At the centre of it all stood a table with a velvet cloth, and on it, encased in a glass dome, was the object everyone was there to see. The Fitzwilliam clock, ornate, golden, a little tarnished, with cherubic faces carved into its sides and Roman numerals swirling toward an enamelled dial. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, pausing before the display, not the clock itself, but the feeling it gives. She said this to no one in particular, yet nearby, Canon Lester glanced over his glasses with a half-smile. "You've the instincts of a cat, Miss Marple, always prowling." The auction began promptly at 3:30. Bidding was polite but enthusiastic. Mrs. Crowthorne snatched up a silver sugar bowl, Dr. Dane took a battered atlas he claimed was for the surgery, and the Fitzwilliam clock went, quite suddenly, to a gentleman no one could quite place. He was tall, stiff in his suit, and had remained quietly near the back until the bidding began. £200. Far above what was expected. A few claps, a ripple of surprise, and then murmurs about where he'd come from. The auction was set to continue, but a shrill cry broke across the lawn. Mrs. Beale, white as flour, stood by the hedge maze bordering the east wing. "Oh, dear heavens!" she gasped, staggering backward. A few rushed over, Canon Lester, Dr. Dane, Miss Marple trailing at a deliberate pace. In the shade of the boxwood hedge, just behind the topiary shaped like a lion, lay the man who had purchased the Fitzwilliam clock. He was crumpled awkwardly on the ground, the dome of the clock shattered beside him, golden fragments scattered. Across the gravel, blood seeped from his temple, dark and thick, a stark contrast against the pale stone path. Dr. Dane crouched down, checked the pulse, then stood. Dead, a nasty blow, possibly struck by the clock itself. There was silence, as though even the birds had paused to listen. Miss Marple peered at the scene with a slight frown. "But why," she murmured, "was he walking toward the hedge with a clock in his arms?" No one had an answer. The constable was sent for, the auction halted, and the guests ushered indoors for tea while questions were asked and lists made of who had seen what. A few claimed they saw the man speaking with Mrs. Crowthorne before the bidding. Someone else thought he had been loitering near the garden shed earlier. But no one knew his name. Miss Marple, seated calmly with her cup of weak Earl Grey, folded her hands. "There's something odd about the whole affair," she said to Mrs. Banbury, who was still trembling slightly and muttering about refunds. "One doesn't bid £200 on an old man's heirloom unless one has a very specific reason, and one doesn't die while carrying it off unless something, or someone, very much wanted that clock to remain behind." Outside, the village constable scratched his head and muttered about accidents. Inside, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the shard of gilt edging that had somehow ended up 6 feet from where the body lay. Then she smiled faintly, almost to herself. Somewhere, in the background, the hall clock struck 4. The Fitzwilliam clock was no longer ticking, but the questions it had awakened were only just beginning. The shock that rippled through St. Hedwig's Cross in the aftermath of the auction was unlike anything the village had seen in decades. Whispers fluttered through lace curtains, and kettle water was reheated 3 times in a single afternoon as speculation brewed stronger than the tea. By nightfall, the entire village had come to a consensus on one matter at least. The man with the clock had not been one of them. Mrs. Banbury, whose home overlooked the green, insisted he wasn't local. "Never seen him in the grocer's, not a eye once, and I keep track, you know, I've got an eye for unfamiliar faces." Meanwhile, old Mr. Judd from the blacksmith's shed told anyone who'd listened that he had seen the fellow loitering outside the church the day before, staring up at the tower like someone measuring its height for sinister reasons. That this directly contradicted his earlier claim, wherein the same man had apparently asked him directions to the auction that very afternoon, was neither acknowledged nor corrected. By the next morning, the news had reached the high street. A chalkboard outside the post office declared, "Man dies holding clock, foul play suspected." Inside, Miss Marple waited patiently for her stamps, while Miss Cranley, the postmistress, leaned forward on the counter and lowered her voice. "They say he'd no identification on him, not a wallet, not a card, just a ticket stub from Paddington and a receipt from an antique shop in Bath." She paused. "Murder, do you think?" Miss Marple offered a polite smile. "One mustn't leap to conclusions, my dear. Accidents are more common than villains. Still," she added softly, "there's something curious about a man who travels to a quiet village, outbids everyone for a clock, and ends up dead within 10 minutes. "Quite," Miss Cranley said, delighted. "Exactly what I said to Mrs. Black. She thinks it's spies. Foreign ones." Elsewhere, the local constable, young Alec Moran, had commandeered the back room of the pub as a temporary inquiry space. He was earnest, well-meaning, and rather intimidated by the idea of murder. Having grown up in St. Hedwig's Cross, the worst he'd encountered on duty was Mrs. Worsley's runaway goat and the occasional row over hedge boundaries. Now he was taking statements in a leather-bound notebook, doing his best to look professional. Canon Lester had already spoken to him, as had Mrs. Beale, though in her account the dead man was alternately tall and short, with either a beard or no beard at all. Dr. Dane had provided the cause of death, blunt force trauma, likely from falling, against the stone border of the garden path. Possibly accident, possibly not. The coroner had been summoned from 2 towns over and was expected to arrive by Thursday. As for the clock, what remained of it was placed in a cloth-lined box and stored under lock and key in the church vestry for lack of a proper evidence room. The golden fragments sparkled still, despite their violent scattering, and the cherubic face of the clock's dial stared blankly upward as though amused by the commotion it had caused. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was engaged in quiet observation. She made no declarations, asked few questions, and yet people spoke freely around her. That afternoon, while tending her forget-me-nots, she was joined by Mrs. Crowthorne, who came bearing gooseberry pie and a head full of commentary.
"It's all very tragic, of course," she said, handing over the tin, "but also rather thrilling in a dreadful sort of way."
"One hears about these things in London, but never here, not in our little village." "No, not often," Miss Marple replied. "Though human nature isn't altered by postcode, is it?" Mrs. Crowthorne gave a short laugh. "I suppose not. And he was rather peculiar, wasn't he, that man? I remember thinking how still he stood. Didn't so much as scratch his nose during the whole auction." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did he speak to you?" "Well, yes, briefly. Before the bidding, he asked if the clock was real. I told him what I knew, that it had come from Mr. Fitzwilliam's house, and that it hadn't worked in years. A lovely thing, though, if you like cherubs." She took a sip of tea. "You don't suppose he was a rival collector, looking to outdo Fitzwilliam even after death?" "Possibly," Miss Marple murmured, "though it seems a long journey to make simply for spite." By the third day, interest had reached Inspector Graves at county headquarters. He arrived in a black motor car just after breakfast, trailed by an assistant and a breath of authority. The villagers watched from behind windows as he conferred with Constable Moran outside the church, gestured toward the garden path, and then disappeared into the vestry to inspect the clock's remains. Later that afternoon, he held an informal gathering in the church hall, inviting anyone who had seen the dead man or noticed anything suspicious to step forward. Most of the village attended under the pretext of helpfulness, but motivated more by curiosity. Miss Marple, seated near the back with her knitting, listened attentively as theories were aired. "He was poisoned beforehand and collapsed," said Mrs. Beale with confidence. "Perhaps he knew something about the Fitzwilliam estate," offered Canon Lester. "Maybe he was after something inside the clock," said young Tommy Burrows, earning a swift shush from his mother. Inspector Graves remained measured. "We've confirmed he came by train from London. No return ticket. His receipt from Bath was for a repair service, clock restoration. It's not clear yet whether the purchase here was planned or spontaneous." He looked up. "Did anyone hear him speak? Know his name?" There was silence. Then Mrs. Crowthorne cleared her throat. "He asked me about the clock. That was all. Seemed very focused, dismissive even. I thought perhaps he was French or Belgian. Had that manner." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Or perhaps someone accustomed to not being questioned. Auction houses attract many such personalities." The inspector noted something, thanked the assembly, and dismissed them with a promise to return the next day. Outside, the air was cool and still. Miss Marple lingered on the steps of the church, glancing once more at the hedgerow near the maze, where the man had fallen. Something about the scene continued to nag at her, a detail not quite in place, not the man, not the clock, but something in how they had intersected. Back in her parlour, she reread an old article she had clipped from a magazine some months earlier about antique forgeries and how certain dealers embedded false mechanisms to mimic the ticking of age. The piece had struck her at the time as quite dull. Now it hummed with potential relevance. And somewhere, between a half-remembered conversation about Mr. Fitzwilliam's final days and the unremarkable smile Mrs. Crowthorne had worn while describing the dead man, a seed of suspicion took root. Nothing conclusive, of course, not yet, but enough to keep her awake that night, eyes closed, mind alert, waiting, just like the cherub on the broken clock face, for the next clue to emerge. Inspector Graves began his inquiries with a routine thoroughness, interviewing everyone who had come within 10 feet of the Fitzwilliam clock on the day of the auction. He brought with him an assistant, Sergeant Ellaby, a quiet young man with a sharp pencil, and the kind of face that suggested he expected everyone to lie. They worked in tandem, collecting statements, matching times, and attempting to recreate the exact sequence of the auction afternoon, though by then memories had already begun to shift with gossip. Constable Moran trailed behind them with earnest determination, his cheeks growing more flushed each time someone offered him tea instead
of information.
At the vicarage, he knocked timidly on the door of Mrs. Banbury, only to be drawn into a rambling account of her hydrangeas before she remembered the subject at hand. "He walked alone, didn't he? Odd, really. Most visitors chat at least a little." But he just looked at the clock and nothing else. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, seemed more interested in the clock than the man who had carried it. "It was damaged on impact," he said while peering at the shards in the vestry. "But look here, some of these breaks were cleaner than others. This hinge had been unscrewed." He turned one piece in his gloved hand. "Someone tampered with it." Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively nearby, looked down at the fragment with a faint purse of her lips. "Mr. Fitzwilliam was known to hide things," she said in a mild tone. "He once told the vicar he kept all his account records inside a hollowed-out chessboard. Perhaps he had similar plans for the clock." Inspector Graves glanced at her.
"And why would a man hide documents in a clock, Miss Marple?" "Because he had something worth hiding, Inspector," she replied gently. "And because he didn't trust safes."
Later that day, Miss Marple visited the Fitzwilliam house, a rambling stone cottage at the edge of the village, still shuttered since the collector's death. The executor of his estate, a solicitor named Mr. Godfrey Drummond, had allowed limited access to the place. The rooms were musty, the curtains drawn. The walls were lined with shelves of curiosities, glass jars filled with faded marbles, ivory letter openers, aged toy soldiers, and books with peeling spines and notes scribbled in the margins. She wandered the library, letting her fingers trace the dust-free line where the Fitzwilliam clock had once stood. Nearby sat a small wooden chest of drawers, each one labelled in the old man's spidery handwriting. Receipts, 1970s, invoices, disputed acquisitions. In one, Miss Marple found a faded letter addressed to Fitzwilliam from an art appraiser in Paris. It warned of continued inquiries and requested return of the disputed item or equivalent value. The clock was mentioned in the margin in a hasty scrawl. Back at the church hall, Inspector Graves was organising the day's notes. Sergeant Ellaby laid out a timeline on the chalkboard, noting who had been where at each stage of the auction. 3 things became clear. First, the deceased had arrived before the event began and waited alone, speaking only briefly to Mrs. Crowthorne. Second, no one could recall seeing him after the winning bid until the scream. And third, a slim window existed, no more than 6 or 7 minutes, between the end of the auction and the moment the body was found. "Too short a time for a planned escape," Ellaby muttered. "If he was targeted, it had to happen quickly, opportunistically." "And he left no luggage at the station," Graves added. "Just himself and the clock. No hotel booking. No one's claimed the body yet." Miss Marple arrived just as the inspector was finishing with Mrs. Beale's contradictory testimony about 2 men in hats and a whiff of spirits near the hedge maze. She waited quietly, observing the drawings and scribbles on the board. Then she stepped forward. "Forgive me," she said, "but may I suggest a small adjustment?" Without waiting, she picked up the chalk and added a dotted line between the back of the auction crowd and the garden path. "There's a side entrance to the vicarage, isn't there, near the east hedge?" Graves raised an eyebrow. "There is." "Then someone could have slipped out quietly," Miss Marple said, "while everyone was watching the final bid. If the victim was being followed, his killer wouldn't have needed to act in the crowd. Just wait until he tried to leave with the clock." Inspector Graves nodded slowly. And the weapon? Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the board. Perhaps it was the clock, or perhaps it was already broken before he picked it up. It was that comment which prompted Graves to revisit the fragments once more, this time bringing a lamp and
magnifier. Under closer inspection, one of the gilded feet of the clock had a smear of something darker, possibly old varnish, but possibly dried blood. Another piece had been wedged improperly, as though it had been hurriedly reassembled after
being taken apart. This wasn't just an accident, Graves muttered. This clock was meant to conceal something. While the inspector examined his evidence, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the village, stopping once more at the post office, then the bakery, then the green. She passed Mrs. Crowthorne, who was speaking animatedly with Reverend Groves about a book club. Miss Marple paused only long enough to observe a curious fact. Mrs. Crowthorne no longer wore the brooch she had on during the auction. A strange thing for someone so attached to her jewellery. That night, Miss Marple sat at her window, the sky outside dark and cool, the stars barely piercing the village's thin fog. Her mind sorted through the events, not in order of appearance, but in order of motive. Who stood to gain from the death of an anonymous man? Who had known the Fitzwilliam clock might hold something more than brass and springs? She recalled a peculiar moment during the auction, the way Dr. Dane had leaned forward slightly just before the final bid, his eyes narrowing not at the bidder, but at the object itself. She remembered Mrs. Crowthorne's hands fluttering toward the table, not to outbid, but to examine the dome. And she remembered Mr. Godfrey Drummond, the solicitor, who had declined to attend the auction at all, yet had visited the Fitzwilliam house twice the week prior, citing legal obligations. The connections were not yet firm, but threads were forming, and somewhere within those threads a truth waited to be pulled into view. The next morning the village buzzed with renewed speculation, now tempered by the inspector's announcement that foul play was being seriously considered. People began to speak more freely, not just of the man who had died, but of the ones who might have wanted him dead. It was Mrs. Banbury who first suggested, over breakfast scones and a letter to her niece, that the dead man had likely been a thief. One of those men who smuggle things across borders, quite criminal, like the ones you read about in the Telegraph. But others were less sure. At the centre of this tangle of opinion stood Miss Marple, as unnoticed as ever, though her mind ticked faster than any antique clock. She had visited the post office again, where Miss Cranley had, with great delight, mentioned that the mysterious man had posted a single envelope before the auction began, addressed to a firm in London, posted with first-class priority. She hadn't opened it, of course, but she'd noted the address, a publishing house known for printing catalogues on fine art and antiquities. This small clue began to form a shape in Miss Marple's thoughts, one that suggested the man had not simply come for the clock, but had known something about its contents, something urgent enough to send by post before claiming it. Whatever had been hidden inside the Fitzwilliam clock had mattered deeply, perhaps to him, perhaps to others. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, had found his first solid suspect in the form of Mr. Godfrey Drummond, the solicitor. Summoned back to the village for further questioning, Drummond arrived with an expression of mild irritation and a carefully packed leather case of documents. "I simply manage the estate," he said, smoothing his waistcoat as he took a seat in the church hall. "Mr. Fitzwilliam left no will and no family. Everything not claimed by the Crown was donated to the village auction. I had no knowledge of a hidden compartment in the clock. But you visited the house twice in the week before the auction," Graves said. "Why?" "To collect tax records," Drummond replied smoothly. A solicitor's duty doesn't end at death, Inspector. It complicates, if anything. Graves pressed further, asking about the deceased man, about whether Drummond recognized his face from any legal or financial dealings. The solicitor denied all knowledge. "Frankly," he said, rising, "I'm as surprised as anyone. I wouldn't know him if he walked in now." "That would be difficult," Sergeant Ellerby muttered under his breath. Miss Marple, seated discreetly by the window, noticed something in Drummond's tone. Not guilt, exactly, but the weary tightness of someone trying very hard not to say something unnecessary. Solicitors were trained to speak only what was required, and yet she wondered, what might he have omitted? The other figure drawing attention was Dr. Dane. Graves visited him late that afternoon, under the pretext of discussing the medical report, but with every intention of observing his behavior. Dane was gracious, offering tea and speaking fluently about cranial injuries and the physics of blunt force trauma. "The clock's dome wouldn't have done it," he said, almost casually. "But the foot could have. Heavy enough if wielded with force." "And how would you know that?" Graves asked. Dane smiled faintly. "'Cause I examined the pieces myself before you arrived. You hadn't locked the box properly." Graves made a note to speak to Constable Moran about that. Then he leaned forward. "You hesitated at the auction. You were seen staring at the clock." "It was familiar," Dane said after a pause. "I treated Fitzwilliam several times in his final year. He was secretive, paranoid. He once ranted for 20 minutes about a man trying to steal his crown piece. I assumed he meant a coin." "Perhaps he meant the clock," Graves said quietly. Miss Marple, who had by then compiled her own mental list of those most connected to the Fitzwilliam estate, decided it was time to visit Mrs. Crowthorne. She found her in the conservatory, polishing her already gleaming brass doorknob collection. The brooch was still missing from her dress. "How are you, dear?" Miss Marple asked, settling into a wicker chair. "Oh, I'm quite all right," Mrs. Crowthorne replied. "A little shaken, of course. One never expects bloodshed on a sunny afternoon, but the world isn't what it used to be, is it?" "No," Miss Marple agreed, glancing around the room. "And yet human nature changes very little. I remember when young Emily Fraser dropped a brooch in the flower-bed during the fête and accused the gardener of theft. Turned out she'd traded it at the sweet shop for toffee." Mrs. Crowthorne blinked. "You've a long memory, Jane." "It helps," Miss Marple said sweetly. "By the way, that brooch you wore to the auction, the gold one with the amethyst, I've always thought it rather striking." Mrs. Crowthorne hesitated. "Oh, that! It must have fallen. I didn't notice it until the next day." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "It's so rare for someone to lose something so secure. I always admired how tightly you pinned it." That evening, Inspector Graves stopped by the vicarage to consult Miss Marple directly. "I must confess," he said, "this case has me spinning. Everyone's lying about something, but I don't yet know which lie matters." Miss Marple nodded. "They're not all lying maliciously. Some lie to preserve pride, some to hide scandal, but I believe you'll find that the key lies not in the clock itself, but in who knew it contained more than it appeared." "You
Mean the victim? Possibly. Or perhaps the killer was already looking for something and saw the clock as a threat." Graves frowned. "Drummond, Dane, or Mrs. Crowthorne? Each has a motive, and each had opportunity." Miss Marple
paused. "But opportunity isn't everything, Inspector. The real question is who feared exposure, who believed the secret would finally come out. Outside, the wind rustled through the hedges. Inside, Miss Marple folded her hands and thought of Fitzwilliam's letter, of the phrase return of the disputed item. of a man from London sending one last envelope before he died. Someone in St. Hedwig's Cross had killed to keep the past buried, and Miss Marple was drawing closer to the unquiet truth behind a dead collector's final secret. The rain came the next morning, light and steady, soaking the cobblestones and turning the village green into a glistening sheet of puddles. Most of St. Hedwig's Cross remained indoors, curtains drawn slightly back as villagers watched the constables trudge across the vicarage lawn once again, heads bowed under hats, boots leaving dark impressions in the grass. But in the calm sitting room of her ivy-covered cottage, Miss Marple was thinking not of the storm nor of the chatter, but of the brooch. It had bothered her, the way Mrs. Crowthorne had brushed off its disappearance. She was not a woman prone to losing things. She was meticulous, nearly obsessive about her appearance and possessions, and if she had dropped the brooch on the auction lawn, someone would have found it. No announcement had been made. No find had been reported. More troubling still was its design. The gold filigree matched the decorative edging of the Fitzwilliam clock almost perfectly. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived once again at the church hall, where Inspector Graves had laid out the key objects of the case: the letter found in Fitzwilliam's drawer, the auction bid list, a partial sketch of the clock's original structure, and a photograph of the deceased, cleaned up, hair combed back, clothes arranged neatly for possible identification. His identity still eluded them. No matches from missing persons. No one from London had responded to the inspector's inquiries. No next of kin had come forward. "I think we may have missed something," Miss Marple said, eyes on the sketch. Graves looked up from his notes. "Go on. Have you examined the underside of the clock's platform? The base, I mean, not just the feet." Graves exchanged a glance with Sergeant Ellaby. "We focused on the shattered dome and upper mechanism." "Then you might not have seen it," she said. Fitzwilliam was clever. He liked symmetry, but he also liked trickery. "I believe he built something into the underside of that platform, a drawer, perhaps, or a false layer." Graves furrowed his brow. "You think
It held something important?" "I think someone believed it did," Miss Marple replied, "and that belief was enough to kill."
With care, the inspector and his sergeant returned to the vestry, where the remnants of the Fitzwilliam clock remained stored. The wooden base, heavier than it appeared, had been dismissed as cosmetic, but now they turned it over and carefully removed a felt panel on the bottom. Beneath it was a narrow slit barely an inch wide. A tiny compartment, concealed under the very heart of the clock, held a folded parchment tucked into the hollow. Graves unfolded it slowly. It was old, worn, and difficult to read at first glance, but there it was. A bill of sale dated 1947, written in French, detailing the acquisition of a gilded Louis XV timepiece and one miniature portrait, attributed to Jacques-Antoine Vallin, 1782. The signature matched that of a Parisian antique dealer mentioned in Fitzwilliam's correspondence. "So it wasn't just a clock," Ellaby muttered. "There was art inside." Miss Marple looked closely at the note, her expression tightening. "That explains the reaction. Someone here knew about the hidden portrait. And the man who came, he knew too. That's why he sent the envelope before he claimed the item, likely with documentation. Proof of theft, perhaps, or authentication for the publisher." "But the portrait wasn't there," Graves said. "No," she agreed, "which means it had already been removed, perhaps before the auction, which leaves us with another question. Who got to it first?" Graves summoned Drummond, Dr. Dane, and Mrs. Crowthorne once again, this time separately, under the pretense of formal follow-up. Miss Marple sat in for each session quietly, knitting in the corner, eyes flicking upward every now and then. Drummond remained composed, though his fingers tapped out a nervous rhythm against the arm of the chair. When shown the French document, he merely raised an eyebrow. Antique sales weren't part of my work. The household inventory went directly to the village committee. I never looked through the clock. And yet, Graves said, you visited the Fitzwilliam estate twice in 1 week. To ensure legal compliance, Drummond said. Nothing more. His answers were crisp, practiced, but Miss Marple noticed the tightening of his jaw when the inspector mentioned the word portrait. Not surprise, recognition. Dr. Dane's session was brief. He admitted that Fitzwilliam had once mentioned a small treasure he'd hidden long ago but never gave details. He liked the
idea of secrets, said the real value of antiques wasn't in what they were, but in what they once held.
When asked if he had seen the underside of the clock, Dane shook his head. Not until now. My guess is that whoever opened it did so before the auction and replaced the dome hastily. That would explain the loose joinery. And what were you looking at during the auction? Miss Marple asked softly. Dane hesitated. The dome, he said. It looked as though it had been removed recently. I could see the smudges. Someone had wiped it quickly but not carefully. Lastly came Mrs. Crowthorne. She entered with grace, gloves on, hat tilted, and posture immaculate. But when shown the document, her face briefly lost its rigidity. I don't read French, she said. The name is clear enough, Graves replied. Valin. It's a known name in miniature portraiture. You wouldn't need to read French to understand its value. I suppose not, she replied, voice tightening. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. You wore a brooch that matched the gilding of the clock. You no longer wear it? I told you. I lost it. But you didn't search for it, Miss Marple said, and no one else found it, which makes me wonder if it wasn't lost at all, but perhaps repurposed.
Or exchanged. A very small portrait could be set inside a brooch, couldn't it? Especially one with an oval centre. Mrs. Crowthorne's face went still. The room held silence for several long seconds. Then Inspector Graves leaned forward. Did
you remove anything from the clock before the auction? No, she said quickly, too quickly. You were on the auction committee, Miss Marple continued gently. You handled the clock during setup. You could have had access to it when no one else was watching. Mrs. Crowthorne's hand trembled faintly, adjusting her glove. I didn't know what it was. But you suspected, Miss Marple said. Enough to keep it. Is that a confession? Graves asked. Mrs. Crowthorne exhaled slowly, fingers curling. I opened the clock the morning before the auction. I saw the panel. I thought it was just old paper, but then I saw the miniature. I didn't think it mattered. I thought Fitzwilliam was just being dramatic. But when that man arrived, when I saw how he stared at the clock, I realized it had value, more than I imagined. I was afraid he would expose me. Graves stood slowly. So you confronted him? No, she said, eyes wide. I didn't.
Kill him. I never even spoke to him again. I swear it. Miss Marple tilted her head. Then someone else did. Someone who saw both of you. Someone who realized what you had taken and feared being implicated.
The room fell quiet once more. Graves tapped the table. Then we need to find that brooch. Mrs. Crowthorne nodded faintly. It's hidden. I'll take you. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streets remained damp, the sky grey and unsettled. Miss Marple stepped onto the path behind the group, watching them head toward the Crowthorne house, her expression unreadable. A piece of the puzzle had emerged, but the picture was still incomplete. Someone else had been watching, waiting, calculating, and someone had struck before the secret could be sent. Mrs. Crowthorne led them through the back lane behind her house, past a row of rain-darkened hedges, and into her conservatory. The room smelled faintly of polish and rosewater, and in the corner stood a mahogany curio cabinet, its glass doors reflecting the cloudy afternoon light. With a trembling hand, she unlocked it, withdrew a small velvet pouch, and laid it on the table. Inside, cushioned in folds of linen, was the brooch. Inspector Graves lifted it carefully, studying the ornate gold setting and the faint hint of a miniature portrait beneath a convex glass cover. It was small, no larger than a walnut, but detailed. A man in profile, in powdered wig and crimson coat, gazed off to the right with melancholy eyes. The signature Valin was faintly visible beneath the painted collar. It was beautiful, Mrs. Crowthorne whispered.
I thought it was simply an antique piece, a token. I only realized how valuable it might be when I saw that man, the way he looked at the clock. It terrified me. Graves exchanged a glance with Sergeant Ellaby and placed the brooch into
an evidence pouch. We'll have it examined properly, but this helps clarify motive. He turned to her. Why not come forward sooner? I thought I could keep it without anyone noticing. Then he died, and I panicked. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the window, spoke softly. People often believe the worst secrets are the ones they can bury with silence, but secrets rarely stay where you put them. They seep out, through glances, gestures, omissions. Mrs. Crowthorne slumped in her chair, the sharpness gone from her features.
I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I swear on my mother's grave, I didn't even follow him. I believe you, Miss Marple said gently. But someone else may have. Someone who feared what that man might reveal. About Fitzwilliam, about the clock, about the people connected to it. That evening, the village was restless. Word of the brooch had not spread, but the mood was different. Tight-lipped, tense, as though everyone was waiting for something.
Miss Marple walked slowly through the churchyard after supper, stopping to look at Fitzwilliam's modest headstone. The man had lived alone for decades, known mostly for his peculiar tastes and sudden temper. But even the most isolated life casts shadows. She paused as footsteps approached. Dr. Dane, arms folded behind his back, greeted her with a slight nod. Out for reflection, Miss Marple? Always, she replied, especially after discoveries. Mrs. Crowthorne's brooch, you mean? She studied him. You've heard. Small village, news travels. And what do you make of it? Dane hesitated, then shrugged. She's not a killer. She's many things, vain, proud, perhaps dishonest, but not violent. If she'd known the portrait was that valuable, she'd have sold it to a collector quietly, not risked exposure. Miss Marple considered his words. You're right, but she wasn't the only one who saw the clock that day, or knew it was being auctioned. You mentioned Fitzwilliam spoke of a crown piece before his death? He did. I thought he was raving. Perhaps he was. But people in fear often dress their truth in riddles. Dane glanced down at the headstone. Do you think the man from London came to claim the portrait? I think he came to reclaim it, she said, which is different. The difference lies in whether it once belonged to him or someone he represented. Miss Marple excused herself shortly after and returned home, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind kept circling back to the victim, his silence, his urgency, his single, posted letter. There was something about him that didn't fit the picture of a thief or a mere rival collector. He had been precise, purposeful, and scared. You don't send documentation by post unless you expect to be stopped or silenced. The next morning, Inspector Graves received confirmation from the London firm. The man had indeed sent a letter, an affidavit, and an accompanying photograph of the portrait, stating it had been looted from a French estate during the war. The collector, Leonard Fitzwilliam, had acquired it under disputed conditions. The man from London, whose name was finally identified as Roland Marchand, had been acting on behalf of the surviving heirs. So he was no thief, Graves said aloud. He was coming to right a wrong. Sergeant Ellerby nodded, which means whoever killed him feared that truth being revealed. Graves called a second meeting with the central figures, Drummond, Dane, and Crowthorne, all under the guise of a final clarification. They gathered in the church hall, tense and unsure of each other now. The inspector began methodically laying out the letter's contents, the painting's origins, the legal implications. Drummond paled. So Fitzwilliam knew it was stolen? Most likely, Graves said. But he hid it nonetheless. And you managed his estate. I didn't know about the portrait, Drummond snapped. If I had, I wouldn't have let it near the auction. And yet, Miss Marple said quietly, you visited the house twice before the sale, alone. Drummond glanced at her, then away. To collect ledgers. Were you in the drawing room? A pause. Briefly. Then you saw the clock. You likely touched it. Perhaps even tested the base. I didn't remove anything, he said. I had no idea what was inside. Dr. Dane leaned forward suddenly. But you knew something was wrong. At the auction, I saw the way you looked at Marchand when he bid. Drummond's face reddened. I recognized him, that's all. I had met him before, years ago. I didn't think he'd come here. Graves's eyes narrowed. And you didn't think to mention this? I didn't connect the dots, Drummond said. Not until later. He was younger then. We met at a conference on art restitution. I didn't know he was involved with the Fitzwilliam case. Miss Marple rose from her chair, walked slowly to the window. When the bidding ended, Marchand left the main lawn. He walked toward the hedge maze with the clock. You were one of the few who followed. I didn't kill him. But someone did. Someone who feared Marchand would expose the theft, and if not you, then who? A long silence followed. Then, softly, a voice behind them spoke. I saw him die, all turned. It was Constable Moran, standing at the door, hat clutched. In his hands, his face was pale. I wasn't meant to be there, he said. I'd gone round the hedge to sneak a smoke.
I saw Marchand come through with the clock. Then Dr. Dane followed. I didn't think anything of it until Marchand fell. It was quick. One blow. Then Dane bent down, wiped something on the clock base and stood back. I didn't know what
to do. The room was still. Dr. Dane exhaled slowly. So you finally speak. Graves stepped forward. Is that true? Moran nodded, eyes on the floor. Dr. Dane didn't deny it. He simply looked tired. Fitzwilliam was my patient and my friend. He trusted me with more than just his ailments. I knew about the portrait. He showed me once, swore me to secrecy. And you thought you were protecting him? Miss Marple
asked. No, I was protecting myself. He left it to me privately, no one knew, and when I saw Marchand, I panicked.
You killed a man to keep a portrait, Graves said, voice cold. I killed a man because I thought the past could be buried, but it never is. Miss Marple turned to leave. No, it never is. The confession struck the village like a hammer, to glass. By noon the next day, it was all anyone could speak of, not just that Dr. Dane had killed the mysterious Mr. Marchand, but that Constable Moran had stood silently in the background, holding the truth in his pocket like a lit match. Most were too stunned to pass judgment. Others were not so kind. Miss Marple remained quiet through the first wave of reaction. She took tea with Mrs. Banbury, who clutched her pearls and lamented that even doctors can be murderers now, and she nodded politely at the grocer when he said he'd never trusted anyone with handwriting that neat. But deep down, she was not satisfied, not quite. Something about the resolution felt manufactured. Final, yes, but not complete. The pieces fit too neatly. The story had symmetry but lacked weight. She returned to the vicarage that afternoon and requested a private word with Inspector Graves. He met her with an exhausted smile, eyes sunken from a night of paperwork, and quiet rage over the constable's silence. "You're not here to tell me we arrested the wrong man, are you?" he said with a sigh, gesturing toward a seat. "I'm not certain," Miss Marple replied calmly, "but I believe the wrong reason may have been accepted too quickly." Graves leaned forward, brows knitting. "Dane admitted to it." Explained.
His motive, said he panicked, yes. And that's exactly what troubles me. Dr. Dane is a methodical man, intelligent, observant, not one to act on impulse.
Especially not in broad daylight during a public event. And then to linger afterward as if nothing had happened? She shook her head. It doesn't fit. He had motive. He had opportunity, Miss Marple corrected gently. But his motive, if we take it at face value, was to protect a gift from Fitzwilliam, a hidden portrait. That may have been valuable, but was it truly worth murder? Graves frowned. "You think there's more?" "I think there's another layer." She leaned back. What if the portrait wasn't the only thing hidden in that clock? Later that evening, Miss Marple paid a discreet visit to the church. Vestry, where the clock remains, had been temporarily relocated while awaiting transfer. With permission from Graves, and under his curious eye, she laid out the components again, this time focusing on the base. She ran her fingers along the inner lining, prodding gently. After a moment, her nail caught on a thin slit in the wood, a second compartment, narrow, deeper than the one before. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and marked only with 2 letters, R.M. She handed it to Graves. He opened it carefully. Inside were 2 items, a typed letter in French and a smaller envelope containing a photograph. The letter was a confession, Fitzwilliam's confession. In it he detailed how the portrait had come into his possession, not by chance or auction, but through a private exchange with a soldier in 1945 who had looted it from a chateau near Rouen. Fitzwilliam had known it was stolen, but he hadn't cared. His collector's pride had eclipsed his conscience. The second envelope held a photograph, grainy, black and white. It showed a younger Fitzwilliam shaking hands with another
man in uniform. Marchand's face was unmistakable, though younger.
On the back was scribbled, "Paris 1947, proof of transfer not to be shown." Graves read it twice, so Marchand knew Fitzwilliam personally. And he had proof, Miss Marple said. That changes everything. Graves sat down slowly.
Then why would Dane kill him? This wasn't about the painting anymore.
No, Miss Marple said softly. But Drummond had reason to care. Graves looked up sharply. The solicitor? Miss Marple nodded. He admitted to recognizing Marchand from a restitution conference, but he withheld that knowledge. And, more importantly, he was the only one who had access to the house, to the documents, to Fitzwilliam's private papers. He would have known about this second letter, possibly even read it, and if Marchand had it mailed to London, Drummond may have assumed wrongly, that it was already too late to cover his tracks. Graves stood, pacing. "So you're saying Drummond was the killer?" Miss Marple rose, adjusting her gloves. "No, I'm saying Drummond convinced Dane to take the fall." The following day, Graves called Dr. Dane back for further questioning. He arrived in plain clothes, no longer hiding behind a veneer of professional dignity. When shown the photograph and the second letter, he said nothing at first, but his shoulders slumped, his face lost colour. "I didn't know about the photo," he said at last. "But yes, I was told Marchand would ruin everything, that Fitzwilliam's name would be dragged through the mud, that I could be implicated, legally or professionally, because I had knowledge of the painting and did nothing." "Who told you that?" Graves asked. Dane hesitated. "Drummond. He said I had to act, that I had no choice." "You had a choice," Miss Marple said from the corner. "But you believed Drummond's words. You believed the threat." Einaki looked at her, then away. "He said Marchand would press charges, that my practice would be destroyed, that even if I told the truth, no one would believe I hadn't been part of the theft." "And so," Graves said grimly, "you let him push you to murder." Dane said nothing more. He didn't need to. That evening, Graves confronted Drummond with the findings. The solicitor denied it all at first, insisted he never read the letter,
Never knew about the photograph, and certainly never pressured anyone.
but the weight of evidence, the unravelled timeline, and Dane's reluctant testimony wore him down. "I didn't ask him to kill the man," Drummond snapped, cornered at last in the church hall. "I only told him the truth, that his life would be destroyed if Marchand went public. I didn't plan anything." "But you orchestrated it," Graves said coldly. "You played on his fear. You didn't need to strike the blow. You only needed someone else to believe it was the only way." Drummond was taken into custody that same evening. The village exhaled in murmurs, some in relief, others in disbelief. Another twist, another layer peeled away. The clock had indeed kept more than just time. It had hidden secrets, betrayal, and a web of manipulation as intricate as any gear within its frame. Miss Marple walked home as the sun dipped beneath the hills. The mystery had grown darker before it cleared. A man had died, not just for art, but for shame, for pride, for secrets better left unspoken. She paused at the garden gate, looking out at the peaceful street. The surface always remained serene in St. Hedwig's Cross, but underneath the currents ran deep. The murder had been solved, but human nature, she reflected, was never truly finished with its surprises. Though Drummond had been arrested and Dr. Dane's role laid bare, something still lingered in the air, an unease like the final page of a book missing from the end of a story. Miss Marple had long ago learned that confession alone did not guarantee truth. It was easy to confess to what could be explained, much harder to explain what no one had yet seen. The village calmed in the following days, but not in the way that suggested peace had returned. Instead, people carried on with deliberate quietness, like actors who'd forgotten their next lines, but kept moving to avoid suspicion. Graves had called in a senior solicitor from county to examine the deeper implications of the portraits. Provenance and the French embassy had sent a request for formal documentation regarding its return. Miss Marple took no part in the legalities. Her concern, as always, lay elsewhere. She sat one afternoon in her garden sipping lukewarm tea when Canon Lester dropped by under the guise of checking on her roses. He lingered longer than usual, commenting on the weather, the price of butter, and the declining strength of the parish's handbell choir. Finally, unable to hold it in, he leaned forward. "Jane," he said. "Do you believe it's all truly finished?" Miss Marple set her cup down. "I believe what's finished has
been told. That's not quite the same. You think there's more."
She didn't nod, but her silence answered for her. Later that evening, she paid a visit to the church vestry, not to see the clock, now packed for evidence transfer, but to ask Sergeant Ellaby a simple question. Was there a second copy of the letter? He looked up from his notes. "You mean Marchand's affidavit?" "No, Fitzwilliam's confession. The one found in the base." He frowned. "No second copy that we've found?" "And yet," Miss Marple said, "Fitzwilliam was a man of redundancies. He duplicated his purchase records, maintained parallel ledgers. If he confessed once, he would have confessed twice. Somewhere, there is another version of that letter." She left him puzzling and made her way down the footpath to the village green. The night was still, the moon faint behind low clouds. Miss Marple had a purpose now, not to find another suspect, but to understand why the killer had waited. Drummond had not killed Marchand. He had manipulated Dane into doing it, but Drummond had never panicked, not truly. He had shown no signs of desperation, no indications of being cornered. Even when arrested, his composure had only cracked when faced with the photograph. Miss Marple revisited the Fitzwilliam house the next day with special permission. She walked the dusty halls slowly, peering again into drawers, cabinets, hollow books. Her eyes paused on a single sheet of yellowed paper inside an unlabeled envelope tucked behind an atlas in the study. A draft version of the same confession, identical in parts but different in others. It lacked the photograph but included one significant detail not mentioned in the first. The miniature portrait, Fitzwilliam noted, had once belonged to a German officer and had been taken in exchange for forged documents. That detail reframed everything. She brought the letter straight to Graves, who read it slowly, then again. "It wasn't just stolen art," he murmured. "It was part of a war cover-up." Miss Marple nodded. "That's why Drummond didn't want it revealed, not because of Fitzwilliam's reputation, but because the truth of its journey might implicate others." Graves stared at the page. "And someone else still wants it buried." "Not someone," Miss Marple said. "Everyone involved in its chain of possession, but there's only one left here with reason to destroy that chain entirely." The next day, she invited Drummond, now released on conditional bail pending legal review, for a quiet walk around the vicarage grounds. He agreed, though his smile was tight and dry. "I hear you found more papers," he said, as they walked the gravel path. "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "It's astonishing how many secrets can fit inside something as small as a clock." Drummond chuckled. "Indeed. And now the French want it back. How tidy." "Tidy things rarely are," she said, "especially in cases involving forged identities, looted items, and men like Roland Marchand." He paused, a subtle stiffness to his steps. "I thought you'd given up the chase." "I never chase," she replied. "I wait, and I observe, like how you were the only one to suggest Dane come forward after the fact. Very clever, very controlled." He turned to her. "Is there a point to this, Miss Marple?" She stopped. "Yes. You didn't manipulate Dane into murder. You only let him believe he had done it." Drummond froze. "You followed Marchand," she continued, "and struck first. Not hard enough to kill, but enough to daze him. Dane arrived, found him collapsed, assumed the worst. You guided his panic, encouraged his guilt, but the blow was yours." He stared at her. "You used the weight of his conscience," she said, "to secure your escape. Drummond's voice was very quiet. "Do you have proof?" "No," she said, smiling. "But that was never the point. Proof is for courts. The truth is for the soul. And yours is now burdened with two secrets. One of theft and one of blood." Didn't speak, but she saw it in his eyes. They parted wordlessly. He left with his head high, but his hands trembling. That night he would pack a small suitcase, lock his law office, and leave on the morning train. No one would see him again in St. Hedwig's Cross. Miss Marple returned to her garden, sat beneath the trellis and watched as a robin landed on the fence. Sometimes, she reflected, justice came not through prison walls but in the cold weight
of being truly seen. The days that followed passed with an unnatural calm, like a village holding its breath.
Drummond's departure was neither dramatic nor acknowledged. No farewells were said, no neighbours waved from their gates. It was simply understood, without ceremony, that he had gone. Only the most curious villagers speculated aloud, wondering why a man of his reputation would vanish so abruptly while awaiting trial. The more prudent whispered in kitchens that he had gone to settle matters in town, though the tone hinted at a deeper truth they didn't want to name. Miss Marple did not mention him again. Not to Inspector Graves, not to Canon Lester, not even to Mrs. Banbury, who, after seeing Drummond's dark coat vanish behind the hill, brought Miss Marple a rhubarb tart and offered nothing but a raised eyebrow. What needed to be done had been done. The miniature portrait, now verified, had been safely transferred to the proper authorities, along with the second confession and the accompanying photograph. Graves had sent off a report to the Home Office summarizing the entire case, though it took him 4 separate drafts before he felt the facts aligned with what had truly happened. Because despite the simplicity of the final outcome, Marchand dead, the painting recovered, Fitzwilliam's secret exposed, the lines between guilt and innocence remained forever blurred. Dr. Dane had been officially cleared of the charge of murder, but his reputation bore the scars. He resumed his work with quiet reluctance, choosing to limit his practice to the elderly and housebound, a form of self-imposed exile. Sergeant Ellaby, for all his sharp record-keeping, admitted later to Graves that he had never truly trusted the timeline as it was presented, but that Miss Marple's presence had kept the case from turning inward on itself. And indeed, it was Miss Marple who brought the final threads together, not through force, not through evidence in the forensic sense, but through the slow, precise unravelling of character. She invited Inspector Graves to tea a week after Drummond's departure. He arrived punctually, hat in hand, face tired but attentive. "I can't stop thinking about the sequence," he admitted after the second biscuit. "Dane told us he found Marchand collapsed, yes, but if he believed himself responsible, why didn't he run? Why stay? Why accept guilt he wasn't certain of?" Miss Marple poured more tea. "Because guilt doesn't require certainty, only suggestion. Dane saw a man injured, believed he had a role in causing it, and was told by someone he trusted that the consequences would ruin him. That's all it took." Graves sighed. "And Drummond? He never lifted the weapon in the end, not directly." "No," Miss Marple said. "But in many ways he committed the most dangerous act of all. He laid the conditions, he made the lie believable, then let others bear its weight." Graves studied her. "That's not something you can prosecute." "No," she agreed. "But it's something you can live, or fail to live with." After the inspector left, Miss Marple walked through the village, her basket empty but her steps steady. The church bells were ringing, marking the close of a long week. She stopped at the green, where children now played again without shadow. Their voices carried freely through the air, unburdened by the grimness that had so recently settled like dust on the village. She sat on the bench by the duck pond, knitting half-heartedly, though her eyes were elsewhere. In truth, she had been watching since the beginning, not just the villagers, but the very nature of how fear moved between them. Fear of exposure, of disgrace, of punishment. The theft of the portrait had been one wrong, yes, but the greater wrong had been how that truth had been concealed for decades under the guise of preservation, respectability, and reputation. Leonard Fitzwilliam had died holding on to his final secret. Drummond had tried to silence the man who came to expose it. Dane had shouldered guilt not entirely his own.
And Mrs. Crowthorne, well, she had faded into her house, her gloves always spotless now, her brooches suddenly less bold. Miss Marple had watched them all, and not once had she rushed to name the villain, because in the end there had been many.
Not just the one who struck the blow. On Sunday morning, the church service went ahead as usual. Canon Lester delivered a sermon about the burden of silence and the quiet strength of confession. He did not name names, he didn't need to. The pews were full, but the air was lighter. Afterward, as villagers gathered in little clusters outside, the church doors, Miss Marple exchanged pleasantries, accepted praise for her clever deductions, and offered not much more than gentle smiles in return. She had never solved crimes for attention. She solved them because no one else thought to watch the things that mattered. That afternoon, she returned home and placed the case notes, her own hand-scribbled observations, into a manila envelope which she labelled and placed into a small wooden chest beside her writing desk. The label read Fitzwilliam Case, Truth versus Guilt. She paused only once to read the final paragraph of Fitzwilliam's second letter again. It had stayed with her. I kept the portrait not for its value, but because it was proof that I had mattered. To someone once, I know what I did was wrong. I only hope that when this truth is found, someone understands that even pride has a lonely origin. Miss Marple closed the envelope gently and locked the chest. That evening, as she watched the last of the sunset stretch across the sky, she thought not of the crime, but of the silence that followed it. Not every story ends with a bang. Some end with a soft click of a clock winding down, a stolen painting returned, and the quiet resignation of those left behind. The Fitzwilliam clock would never tick again, but it had told its final tale. Summer returned to St. Hedwig's Cross slowly, as if testing the village's ability to bear brightness again. The roses bloomed along the vicarage fence. The baker's window was once again filled with warm buns by 8 o'clock sharp, and even the church organ, silent for 2 Sundays, resumed its gentle hum. On the surface, all seemed right again, but underneath, the ripples of what had happened, what had been uncovered, moved on quietly and without fanfare, as ripples always do. Miss Marple resumed her routines without comment. She watered her violets, mended the vicar's cuff buttons, and even sent a congratulatory card to young Sarah Crowthorne on her engagement, though she added no personal note. She made no mention of the brooch, or the portrait, or the man who had tried to bury both. Drummond's absence was spoken of less and less. People assumed he would not return, and most were glad not to see him. A distant cousin from Kent was named interim executor of Fitzwilliam's estate, and he dutifully completed what Drummond had left in half-finished folders. With the portrait now in the hands of the French embassy, no further objections were
raised. There would be no trial, no charges, nothing official remained. But truth is rarely measured by paper.
Dr. Dane, now quieter, more aged than before, continued tending to the village with careful detachment. He walked with a slower gait, as though each step weighed something. He no longer held his appointments in his drawing room, but met patients at their homes. Most welcomed him still. A few, privately, changed doctors. Miss Marple did not. She still called him when her knee grew stiff. She never mentioned the day he'd stared down at a man who was not yet dead and assumed he had become a killer. Only once did she speak with him about the case after everything had settled. It was late afternoon, the air thick with honeysuckle, and Miss Marple sat in her parlour, Dane seated across from her, his hat in his lap. "I had convinced myself it was for the best," he said, voice low. "That the lesser crime, mine, was in some way noble, protective." "You were misled," she said gently. "I let myself be misled." "There's a difference," she nodded. "We are none of us perfect, Doctor, but admitting fault honestly, and without disguise, that is a rare strength." He looked at her. "Do you think I was weak?" "I think you were human," she replied. "And afraid. We all are, when our place in the world begins to shift beneath us." Dane left shortly after, and Miss Marple sat by the window for a long time, watching a single swallow dip and dart through the golden sky. Some guilt could be soothed, she thought. Some remained like old scars, healed but never gone. That weekend, the vicar hosted a small gathering in the church garden to raise money for roof repairs. The tables were dressed in white linen, the cakes homemade, the lemonade a little too tart. Children ran through the hedges where Marchand had once fallen, their laughter masking the memory. And no one mentioned the clock, but the air felt lighter as, she passed through the tables, Miss Marple paused at one selling books and trinkets. A small brass timepiece sat among the donations, its hands frozen at 12:30. She smiled at it, said nothing, and moved on. Canon Lester found her near the garden gate as the sun began to set. "You've done a great service to the village, Jane," he said. "I did nothing more than listen," she replied. "Which is more than most ever do." She thanked him and left, her steps slow but steady, the gentle click of her heels blending with the soft chirping of the evening birds. At home, she set her knitting aside and opened the small wooden chest again. She took out the Fitzwilliam file, reviewed the notes once more, not because she needed to, but because she liked things finished properly. At the bottom of the stack was the final letter Fitzwilliam had written, one he had not sent, addressed only to whom it may concern. "If you are reading this," it began, "then the clock has given up its secret. I only ask that you remember the art within it was once seen as a treasure. I never meant to steal history, I only wanted to keep beauty near me in a world that no longer gave it freely." Miss Marple folded the page carefully, replaced it, and closed the chest. That night she slept with the window open, the summer breeze lifting the lace curtains gently. In the distance, a train whistled through the countryside. She imagined it, winding away from the village, from the past, from guilt and from pride. And then she smiled. Not all stories end with justice as it is written in law. Some end with truth uncovered, consequences faced, and lives changed in small, silent ways. The Fitzwilliam clock had stopped ticking long ago, but what it had held, a confession, a portrait, a secret too long kept, had finally been brought into the light. In the quiet stillness of her home, Miss Marple closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of peace. The mystery was over, and life, with all its quiet complexities, continued.